When I saw my husband reach for his phone during dinner, I thought he was just checking another email. He always did that mid-sentence, mid-laugh, mid-anything. But then I saw how his eyes narrowed, how his shoulders tensed. The phone wasn't his. It was mine. I had left it on the kitchen counter. And now he held it, screen glowing, the message previews already sliding into view. My breath caught. My fork hovered mid-air. I wanted to say something, to stand up and snatch it, to pretend it was some silly misunderstanding, but my body froze. He opened the screen. He began to scroll. I watched, helpless, as words I had read and reread in secret now reflected off his face. He didn't react immediately. Just stared. And then his jaw tightened. A muscle near his temple twitched. I wanted to close my eyes, to vanish into the floor. But I sat there, every inch of me vibrating with dread. Then came the moment I feared most, a new message lit up the screen. From him. The man I should have never replied to. The one whose name alone could unravel everything. My husband didn't speak. He just looked up at me, his eyes unreadable. I tried to swallow, but my mouth was dry. His voice, when it came, was quiet. You want to explain this? I didn't. I couldn't. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One that changed the shape of everything that followed. Let me tell you how it happened, before the truth, the whole truth, buries me alive. But first, write in the comments where you're watching this from, and tell me, have you ever carried a secret that almost destroyed everything you loved? The day we drove to his mother's house, I thought the hardest part would be pretending I cared about her antique dishes or her endless critiques of our furniture choices. I didn't expect to be standing in front of a mirror later that night, wondering who the woman in the reflection had become. We were invited for a long weekend, something about a family tradition, something I had forgotten about until it was too late to say no. His mother had always intimidated me. Not in the theatrical, cruel way people often describe mother-in-laws. No, her weapon of choice was subtlety. A raised eyebrow, a delayed pause before speaking, a faint look of disapproval that never made it to her lips. She was a master of controlled judgment. The house was large, old, full of curated silence. Every clock ticked in unison, and every surface shined as if it had been wiped seconds before we arrived. His brother opened the door. I had never met him. He was supposed to be out of town but had returned unexpectedly. That was the first shift. He greeted us with warmth, an ease I didn't expect. He hugged me with a confidence I wasn't prepared for. His hand on my back lingered, maybe a second too long. Maybe it was just my imagination. I told myself not to read into anything. I had always been good at dismissing little things. It was easier than confronting what they might mean. But something about his presence unsettled me. Not in a threatening way. In a way that made me feel seen. Too seen. At dinner, I sat between my husband and his brother. The conversation floated around me, investments, sports, family, friends I had never met. My husband was in his element, talking numbers with his mother, sipping wine slowly, glancing at his phone every few minutes. I tried to contribute, but everything I said landed with a soft thud, like a tennis ball hitting velvet. The only person who seemed to be listening was his brother. He asked me how I liked the garden. I told him it was beautiful. He said he planted the lavender himself, and for a moment, we talked only about that. Just lavender. Its scent. Its color. Its stubbornness in the soil. He smiled, and I smiled back. It felt simple. Too simple. Later, after the dishes were cleared and the fire dimmed, I found myself walking alone outside. The air was crisp, still carrying a trace of sun-warmed earth. I wrapped my arms around myself, more for control than warmth. I didn't hear him approach. He was suddenly beside me, holding a blanket. "Thought you might be cold," he said. "Thanks," I replied, taking it, careful not to let our fingers touch. We stood in silence. The kind of silence that crackled with things unsaid. He asked if I liked the house. I said I did. He asked if I was happy. I hesitated too long. "I mean, yeah," I said eventually. That didn't sound convincing. I laughed softly, trying to brush it off, but the crack in my voice betrayed me. He looked at me, not the way someone looks at a stranger. Not even the way someone looks at a sister-in-law. He looked at me like he could see every restless night, every half-finished sentence I never dared to say aloud. "You ever feel like you're watching your own life from the outside?" he asked. "Yes," I answered before I could stop myself. We didn't speak after that. We just stood there, breathing in the same rhythm. I didn't know what this was. I only knew it scared me. When I went back inside, my husband was already asleep on the couch, phone in hand, a news app open. I stood there, watching him, the man I had shared decades with. The man who used to touch the small of my back for no reason. Who used to write me notes in the middle of meetings. Who used to look at me as if I were the only person in a crowded room. Now, I was invisible again. I changed into my nightclothes and stared at the ceiling for hours. I didn't sleep. I just listened to the creak of the old wood, the distant tick of antique clocks, and the soft thrum of guilt I couldn't explain, not yet. Something had started. I didn't know its shape or its consequences. Only that it was no longer something I could pretend I hadn't felt. And in that dark, still room, I realized this weekend would change everything, even if I spent the next few days pretending otherwise. The next morning, I woke up before anyone else. The house was silent, as if it, too, was still sleeping. I sat at the edge of the guest bed, staring at my feet, the carpet beneath them patterned with roses that had long since faded. Everything in this house seemed preserved from another decade. Untouched. Like it had decided long ago it would rather remain in the past than move with the rest of us. I dressed quietly, pulling my sweater over my head, brushing my hair without a mirror. I didn't want to see myself. I didn't want to see the flicker of something I couldn't name, something that felt like fear and something else, dangerously close to longing. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of fresh coffee. He was already there. Alone. Leaning against the counter, holding a mug between his palms like he needed the warmth more than the caffeine. I hesitated in the doorway. He didn't look at me, but he knew I was there. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his voice low, casual, like we were discussing the weather. I shook my head. Too much on my mind. There was a pause, not long, but full. Full of the memory of last night, of standing in the cold air, of his voice asking if I was happy. He handed me a mug. Our fingers didn't touch. I was careful this time. We drank in silence, standing on opposite sides of the kitchen. I tried to focus on the ticking of the clock, the sound of the refrigerator humming. Anything but him. Eventually, I excused myself and said I'd go for a walk. He offered to join. I didn't refuse. The trail behind the house led through a small forest, dense with green and gold. The leaves whispered above us, the way they always do when no one else is listening. We walked slowly. No destination, just movement. I asked him about his work. He told me about projects, about people I didn't know. He spoke with his hands, and I watched the way his face shifted when he talked about things that mattered to him. I realized how little I knew him. And how much I wanted to. When he asked me about my life, I hesitated. I talked about routines. My job. The garden I had tried to start, the books I kept meaning to finish. I didn't mention how I felt most mornings. The heaviness. The stillness between us at home that no amount of talking seemed to fill. We reached a clearing. He sat on a fallen log. I stood. "You can sit," he said, looking up at me with something unreadable in his expression. I did. Not too close. Not too far. The wind picked up. I pulled my sweater tighter. He noticed. "I still think you look cold," he said. "Even when you pretend you're not." I turned to him. "Maybe I am." And for a moment, neither of us moved. There was only the sound of the trees and the distance we hadn't yet crossed. He didn't say anything else. Just looked at me. And God help me, I looked back. Because I couldn't look away. Later, when we returned to the house, everything had shifted. Slightly. Subtly. But enough for me to feel it in my skin. My husband was on the phone. Work again. Always work. He waved at me as I walked in, mouthing something about a client call. I nodded. I didn't feel anything. Not even irritation. Just a numb sort of acceptance. His mother was baking. The smell of cinnamon filled the air. She didn't say anything to me, just gave me a nod, as if to remind me I was still a guest. Still not quite family. I spent the afternoon helping with small things. Folding laundry that wasn't mine. Wiping counters. Pretending I had a purpose in a house that didn't need me. He appeared in the doorway around 4, holding a bag of groceries. "I thought we could drive into town," he said. "Your husband said he's stuck on calls. Figured we'd be useful." It made sense. On the surface. And I didn't argue. The drive into town was quiet at first. The radio played something soft, old. He drummed his fingers on the wheel. At a red light, he turned to me. "You've changed," he said. I blinked. "What do you mean?" "I remember photos. Stories. You used to laugh more." That landed somewhere I wasn't ready for. I looked out the window. The trees blurred past. "People change," I said finally. "Some do. Others just forget how to be who they were." We stopped at a small market. He held the door open for me. I stepped inside, grateful for the distraction. We moved through the aisles, collecting bread, fruit, milk. Normal things. But my hands trembled when they brushed his while reaching for the same carton of eggs. Outside, the wind had picked up. I held the bag against my chest. He stood closer than he needed to. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded too quickly. On the drive back, we didn't talk. The silence was loud. Full of things neither of us knew how to say. We parked in the driveway. The house was lit up, warm and still. But neither of us moved. He turned off the engine. Looked straight ahead. "I shouldn't say this," he began. "Then don't," I interrupted. We sat there, breathing in sync, caught between the comfort of denial and the edge of something neither of us had planned. Then, softly, before I could stop him, he leaned toward me. And I let it happen. We kissed. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake in the guest room, eyes fixed on the ceiling, heart racing with a rhythm I couldn't calm. The darkness felt heavier than usual, like the silence was accusing me, pressing against my chest with every breath I tried to take. I kept replaying the moment in the car, over and over, as if repetition might dull the guilt. But it didn't. It only deepened the ache. When I closed my eyes, I could still feel the heat of his skin near mine, the brief electric pull before we parted, the way the air had thickened between us like the seconds had tried to stretch themselves into hours. I hadn't said anything afterward. Neither had he. We had walked inside separately, quietly, slipping past each other like ghosts in our own lives. The next morning, my husband was already gone. His side of the bed was cold, the sheets perfectly smoothed, like he hadn't really been there at all. I found a note in the hallway, emergency at the site. I'll be back late tonight. Don't wait up. The words barely registered. I stood there in my robe, note in hand, and realized this was how it always was. Pieces of him left behind in ink, in voicemail, in text messages. Rarely in presence. Rarely in touch. I went downstairs and tried to function like everything was normal. I made tea. Toast. I smiled when his mother walked in and offered to help with breakfast. She declined with her usual polite detachment, waving me off like a houseguest who didn't know the rules. I wondered if she could see it on my face, guilt. Desire. Confusion. I wondered if I was already unraveling in ways too obvious to conceal. He entered the kitchen a little while later, his shirt wrinkled, hair still damp from a shower. He greeted everyone the same. Polite. Casual. Perfectly neutral. But his eyes caught mine for just a second too long, and I knew we were both pretending. We had started something we couldn't undo, and now we had to wear the illusion like a borrowed coat. The hours blurred. I folded laundry that wasn't mine. I listened to stories I didn't care about. I sat in the living room with his mother while she talked about family traditions, all the while feeling like I was floating just outside the edges of reality. I couldn't stop thinking. About the kiss. About what it meant. About whether it was truly the first line crossed, or just the first we allowed ourselves to see. Around midday, I went out to the backyard to clear my head. The garden was quiet, blooming with early summer color. Bees hovered over the lavender, the same lavender he said he had planted. I knelt beside it, ran my fingers along the stems, and wondered how something so small could survive in silence, in soil, in pressure. I wondered if I could. I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn. "You're avoiding me," he said. I didn't answer. The breeze moved through the trees. I focused on the sound of it, trying to anchor myself. "I didn't plan any of this," he said. I finally looked at him. Neither did I. We stood there, the weight of the unspoken pressing into the space between us. I wanted to say it was just a moment, just a mistake. But it wasn't. It had been building from the second we met. From that first glance, that first shared silence, that first time he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. I told him we needed to stop. That it couldn't happen again. That I wouldn't let it. He nodded, slowly. "All right," he said. But the way he said it told me he didn't believe me. I wasn't even sure I believed myself. That night, the house felt colder. My husband still hadn't returned. I tried to call him, but it went to voicemail. I left a message, something mundane about hoping he was okay, but my voice shook more than I wanted it to. I hated how easy it had become to lie, even in tone. Dinner was quiet. His mother made roast chicken. She offered me a glass of wine, and I took it even though I didn't want it. I needed something in my hands, something to do besides pick at the plate in front of me. Across the table, he didn't look at me. Not once. I tried to focus on that. On the distance he was forcing between us. It should have helped. But it only made the ache grow sharper. After dinner, I offered to do the dishes. She hesitated, then relented. She went upstairs, leaving me alone in the kitchen. I stood at the sink, scrubbing plates that didn't need scrubbing, trying to wash away something that wouldn't lift from my skin. I didn't hear him come in, but I felt it. The shift in air. The silence that followed. He stood in the doorway. I kept my back to him. I meant it, I said. It can't happen again. I know, he replied. But that doesn't mean it didn't. I turned, slowly. He looked tired. Like he hadn't slept either. Like the guilt was clinging to him too. This isn't me, I whispered. He nodded. It's not me either. But we were here. And it had happened. And pretending otherwise would be just another lie stacked on top of all the others. He walked away without another word. I dried my hands, turned off the light, and went to bed alone. Again. That night, I dreamed of fire. Of a house burning from the inside out. And I was standing in the middle of it, unable to move, watching the walls turn to ash. When I woke, my pillow was damp with tears I hadn't remembered crying. The next morning began with the sound of birds and the scent of something baking downstairs. I sat up slowly, as if waking too fast might cause something to break inside me. My head throbbed with exhaustion, but sleep hadn't offered any real rest. Only flashes of dreams that made no sense, doors I couldn't open, voices I couldn't quite hear, an ocean pulling me under. I rubbed my eyes and forced myself to stand. I moved through the motions like someone rehearsing a life. Wash face. Comb hair. Dress. Smile in the mirror. It was all habit by now, just enough to look like a person who was fine. Just enough to avoid suspicion. Downstairs, the house was unusually quiet. My husband still hadn't returned. I checked my phone, one unread message. A picture of paperwork, some work site updates. Nothing personal. No, I miss you. No, how are you? Just details. That was how he loved me these days, in bullet points and status reports. In the kitchen, his mother had laid out pastries on a tray with her usual precision. She nodded when I entered, offering me coffee without asking. I accepted. Her kindness was the restrained sort, like she was checking boxes off a list labeled hostess etiquette. I took my coffee to the back porch. The air was cool and the morning sunlight cast long shadows across the grass. I sat in one of the old wooden chairs and tried to focus on the present moment. The birds. The wind. The sound of life continuing around me, indifferent to my inner collapse. He came out a few minutes later. I heard the door creak and felt his presence before I turned. He didn't speak. Just sat in the chair beside mine, holding his own mug, staring out at the garden like I was. We sat in silence, the kind that had weight and texture. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't unravel everything. I wasn't even sure there was anything left to protect. I'm leaving tomorrow, he said after a long pause. I didn't look at him. For good? No, he said quietly. Just giving us space. Giving you space. The words didn't land the way I thought they would. I didn't feel relief. Or disappointment. Just an ache where everything used to feel solid. Maybe that's for the best, I replied, even though I wasn't sure I believed it. He stood, drained the last of his coffee, and went back inside. I remained on the porch, staring into the lavender. Trying not to think about the fact that I'd miss him more than I should. The rest of the day dragged. I tried to keep busy, folding towels, wiping windows that didn't need cleaning, organizing drawers I had no reason to open. His mother seemed pleased with my efforts, commenting that it was nice to have a woman's touch around the house. The irony stung. I smiled anyway. By late afternoon, I was exhausted but restless. I went out for a walk, hoping the movement would shake something loose. The path through the woods behind the house felt familiar now, like the only place where I could breathe without pretending. I didn't expect to see him there. He was sitting on the same log as before, elbows on his knees, head bowed like the world had grown too heavy. He looked up when he heard my steps but didn't move. I stopped a few feet away, unsure if I should turn back or sit down. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I just wanted to be here one last time." I hesitated, then sat beside him, again, not too close. But not distant either. The trees rustled overhead. The light shifted between branches, dappling the ground with gold and shadow. It felt like we were caught in a moment outside of time. "I keep trying to figure out how we got here," I said softly. "When it all shifted." He exhaled slowly. "I think it started the second we stopped pretending to be who they needed us to be." I looked down at my hands. "And what if who I am now is someone I don't recognize?" "Then maybe," he said, "it's time to get to know her." We didn't speak after that. We just sat. Two people carrying more than they knew how to hold, trying not to drop any of it on the other. There was no resolution. No neat ending. Just a quiet understanding that whatever we had become, it wasn't accidental. When we returned to the house, the sun had already begun to dip below the trees. The sky glowed with that soft amber light that makes everything look like a memory. I paused before going inside, taking one last breath of the outside air. Trying to store the feeling of it somewhere safe. Dinner was silent. My husband still hadn't returned. His mother didn't mention it. She talked about recipes instead, as if nothing in the world could be wrong as long as there was dessert. Afterward, I excused myself early and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones. I wanted to cry, but no tears came. I wanted to sleep, but my body refused to rest. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many ceilings I'd stared at in my life. How many moments of silence I had endured without ever truly hearing myself. And then I heard footsteps. I froze. A knock on the door. Gentle. Hesitant. I rose, heart pounding, and opened it. He stood there, suitcase in hand. "I'm heading out early," he said. "Didn't want to leave without saying goodbye." I nodded, unable to form words. He looked at me for a long moment, like he wanted to say something more. But he didn't. He just gave a small nod and turned to go. I watched him walk down the hallway, down the stairs, out the front door. And for the first time in weeks, I felt truly alone. I closed the door and leaned against it, breath shallow. I wanted to scream, to tear something apart, to undo whatever had been set in motion. But all I could do was stand there, trembling. Because what had happened between us wasn't just a mistake. It was a mirror. And now I had to decide whether to look into it, or look away forever. The following morning came like a fogged window, blurry, quiet, and cold despite the sun. I woke up in the same position I had fallen asleep, still in yesterday's clothes, my limbs heavy from another night of restless, tangled thoughts. The space around me felt hollow. He was gone now, and the absence was louder than his presence had ever dared to be. I sat up slowly, glancing at the corner of the room where his suitcase had stood only hours earlier. Nothing remained, not even the faintest imprint of his presence. He had left without making a sound, without disturbing the stillness that had cocooned this house for decades. The only thing that lingered was the weight of what had happened, and the question of how I was supposed to carry it. Downstairs, the day moved forward as if nothing had changed. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and coffee. His mother was at the table, meticulously folding linen napkins. I greeted her with a nod and poured myself some tea. She didn't ask about him. She didn't mention his departure. Perhaps she didn't know. Or perhaps she knew too much and preferred silence over confrontation. My husband still hadn't returned. His absence, once a source of quiet resentment, now felt like a shield, fragile but convenient. I clung to it, letting it protect me from what might come next. I spent most of the day in the garden, pretending to be interested in pruning, watering, and pulling weeds that barely existed. I needed something to do with my hands, something that gave the illusion of control. The earth was soft, forgiving beneath my fingers. I let the dirt settle into my palms, hoping it would ground me. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a muted gray. Clouds rolled in from the north, and the wind carried a sharpness that whispered of coming rain. I stood alone among the lavender, brushing the tips of the flowers lightly with my fingers, and thought of how it had all begun with such an innocent gesture. A glance. A question. A space between words that had opened too wide. I didn't hear the car pull up. I only noticed the change in the air, the way it tightened around me like a thread being pulled. I turned slowly and saw him standing by the porch steps. My husband. He looked tired. His jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, and the skin around his eyes was shadowed with fatigue. He didn't smile when he saw me. He didn't frown either. Just stood there, studying me as if unsure of who I had become in his absence. I walked toward him slowly, unsure of what to say. The usual greetings, "You're back," or "How was it?" felt hollow, performative. Instead, I just nodded. He returned the gesture, then brushed past me without a word, entering the house with the weariness of someone who had been fighting too many battles alone. Inside, he placed his bag near the stairs and went straight to the kitchen. I followed, not out of duty, but out of a need to understand what this moment would mean. He poured himself some coffee. Sat at the table. Looked at me. "You okay?" he asked. It wasn't the question I expected. "I don't know," I said honestly. He nodded slowly, as if the answer didn't surprise him. "I got your message. The one about the garden." "I didn't say much," I replied. "You said enough." The silence that followed was not angry. Not cold. Just tired. Two people sharing a table, each holding pieces the other no longer recognized. That evening, I tried to act as though things were returning to normal. I made dinner. Nothing elaborate, just pasta, garlic bread, and a salad with too much vinegar. He ate quietly, offered no commentary. His mother complimented the seasoning, then excused herself early, claiming a headache. After the dishes were washed and the kitchen cleaned, he asked me if I wanted to take a walk. We hadn't done that in years. We stepped outside into the cool night air. The wind had picked up, and leaves danced along the stone path as we moved in silence. Our steps were in sync, but everything else felt misaligned. "Did something happen while I was gone?" he asked suddenly, without looking at me. My breath caught. I didn't respond right away. "I just want the truth," he added. "I'm not going to ask for details." I stopped walking. Stared out at the field that stretched beyond the garden. "I made a mistake," I said. The words felt like shards leaving my mouth. A brief one. But enough. He exhaled, long and low. He didn't speak. "I didn't plan it," I continued. "It wasn't something I looked for." He turned to me finally, his eyes unreadable. "I think I stopped seeing you," he said. "Somewhere along the way, I forgot to look." I nodded. "And I stopped asking to be seen." Neither of us cried. There were no dramatic outbursts, no sudden reconciliations. Just the quiet devastation of two people finally telling the truth. We walked back to the house in silence. At the porch, he paused and looked at me again. "Do you want to stay?" he asked. "I don't know," I answered. He nodded once and opened the door. That night, we slept in the same bed for the first time in weeks. Back to back. A chasm between us. But sleep finally came, not deep, not peaceful, but real. And that was something. The morning light crept through the window, soft and pale, casting thin golden lines across the sheets. I woke up slowly, disoriented at first by the unusual stillness of my own body. For once, I hadn't tossed or turned. I hadn't wept in my sleep or gasped myself awake. The quiet wasn't comforting, but it wasn't suffocating either. It simply was. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of breathing beside me. His back was still to mine, but the distance between us had lessened during the night. I could feel his warmth now. Not touching, but close enough to remind me that we once used to belong to each other in the quiet like this. Before the noise, before the forgetting. I stayed there for a while, eyes open, trying to process the new shape of everything. There was no resolution. No forgiveness. No punishment. Just a fragile truce, like the first few moments after a storm when everything is too wet and too broken to move, but the clouds are finally gone. Eventually, I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. I moved through the motions of the morning, brushing my teeth, changing clothes, tying back my hair. Each gesture felt like an echo of someone else's life, someone I used to be before everything bent under the weight of silence and longing. Downstairs, the house was still. His mother wasn't in the kitchen, which was unusual. A note on the counter said she had gone into town and would be back by lunch. I poured myself some tea, not out of thirst, but out of habit. I sipped it slowly, staring out the window at the garden. The lavender was fading. The blooms that had looked so vibrant days ago were starting to wilt. I watched them, wondering if they would come back next year, or if they would simply disappear like so many other beautiful things left unattended. He came down not long after. I heard the stairs creak beneath his feet, the quiet rustle of fabric as he entered the room. He didn't speak. Neither did I. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, just as he always had. But something was different now. His shoulders carried less tension. His eyes, when they met mine, didn't flinch. We stood in silence, sipping our drinks, two people who had broken something without fully understanding how to fix it. And yet, here we were. Sharing a room. Breathing the same air. Still trying. I need to go into town, I said eventually. Just to get some fresh air. He nodded, not asking to join, not questioning why. I left the house with a jacket slung over my arm, the keys to his car in hand, and 100 thoughts bouncing against the inside of my skull. The drive was short. The road familiar. Trees on either side formed a kind of tunnel, their leaves rustling like whispered warnings. When I arrived, I parked near the main square. The town was small, quiet, charming in the way old places are. I walked past the bookstore, the bakery, the post office. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to move. I ended up at a small cafe tucked between two brick buildings. I ordered a coffee I didn't want and took a seat by the window. I watched people pass, an older couple holding hands, a young woman walking a dog, a man balancing groceries and a phone. Ordinary moments. The kind I used to envy without realizing it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old pictures. Most were of places, trips we had taken, rooms we had redecorated, gardens we had planted. Very few were of us together. And the ones that were, we looked happy. Or at least like we knew how to perform happiness. Smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Hands that touched, but with distance in the space between fingers. I didn't cry. I just felt tired. Like I had been holding my breath for too long. After a while, I left the cafe and wandered back to the car. I drove aimlessly, letting the road decide for me. I ended up at the lake, an old spot we used to visit before life became too full of deadlines and obligations. The water was still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. I got out and walked to the edge. Sat on a bench. Listened to the quiet. He found me there an hour later. I didn't ask how. I wasn't surprised. He sat beside me, neither of us speaking for a long time. We watched the water. The sky. A pair of ducks drifting along the surface. Eventually, he said, I didn't come to accuse you. I know. I came because I've been gone for longer than I thought. I turned to him. His face was calm, but not empty. There was something there, regret, maybe. Or grief. I missed you, I said, and the honesty of it startled even me. I missed you too, he replied. But I didn't know how to show it. I thought providing was enough. I thought being reliable was the same thing as being present. It's not, I whispered. But I let you believe it was. He nodded. Maybe we both did. There was nothing romantic about the moment. No swelling music, no dramatic declarations. Just two people sitting by a lake, mourning a version of their lives that had quietly faded without anyone noticing. We drove back in silence. But it wasn't heavy. It was just full. When we returned to the house, his mother was in the garden, pruning the rose bushes. She glanced at us, said nothing, and continued her work. Inside, the house felt warmer somehow. Like the walls had stopped holding their breath. That evening, after dinner, we sat on the porch together. We didn't talk much. Just sat, side by side, watching the sky turn gold, then orange, then a deepening blue. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was pretending. I just felt like someone trying. Trying to stay. Trying to heal. Trying to believe in the possibility that not everything broken had to stay that way. The rain started late that night, soft at first, then steadier, filling the silence with a rhythm that felt almost like comfort. I lay awake listening to it, the window cracked open just enough to let the scent of wet earth drift inside. The house had settled into sleep, creaking gently in the night. I could hear the occasional floorboard groan, the wind brushing against the glass like an old memory. Everything felt distant, as if life were unfolding in another room I was no longer part of. He was beside me in bed, though we hadn't touched in hours. His breathing was slow, even, a lullaby of familiarity. And yet I felt entirely alone. Not because of him. Not because of us. But because of what I had done, and the quiet, terrible knowledge that no matter how much I wanted to erase it, it had happened. I turned on my side and stared at the ceiling. I thought about everything, how it began, what I allowed, what I wanted to believe it meant. The worst part wasn't the guilt. The worst part was how easy it had been to cross the line. How natural it had felt in the moment. Like something I hadn't even known I needed until it was too late. At some point, I got up and went downstairs. The kitchen light was still on, casting a soft glow across the tiled floor. I wrapped myself in a shawl and stood by the window, watching the rain trace long lines down the glass. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a sign. Maybe a reason to believe that some things could still be mended. The clock on the wall ticked louder in the quiet. I tried to breathe deeply, to stay grounded. I made a cup of tea, though I didn't really want it. The ritual helped. One step, then another. I sat at the table, hands wrapped around the mug, letting the warmth seep into my skin. I felt numb and raw all at once, like I was unraveling thread by thread, and yet holding myself together out of sheer necessity. I didn't cry. The tears had dried up days ago. All that remained was a dull ache behind my ribs, like grief without a name. The door creaked behind me. I turned, expecting to see him, but it wasn't my husband. It was his brother. I froze, unsure of what to say, unsure of what he knew or felt. He looked tired, rain droplets clinging to the sleeves of his shirt. He hesitated in the doorway for a long second before stepping into the kitchen. "I couldn't sleep," he said quietly. "Me neither." He walked to the counter and poured himself a glass of water. I watched his movements, deliberate, familiar, a rhythm I had memorized without meaning to. He leaned against the counter, his gaze distant. "You're leaving tomorrow, right?" I asked. He nodded. That was the plan. "And is it still?" "I don't know," he admitted. The silence stretched between us like a tightrope. I didn't know whether to keep speaking or to let it hang there, unresolved. The tension wasn't like before. It wasn't charged or exciting. It was heavy. Regretful. He looked at me then, really looked at me. "Do you regret it?" he asked. I hesitated. "I regret what it cost." He nodded slowly, as if he understood. "We weren't thinking," he said. "Or maybe we were thinking too much." I lowered my gaze. "It doesn't matter now. What's done is done." He set down the glass and approached the table. For a moment, I thought he might sit across from me, continue the conversation. But he didn't. He stopped a few feet away and simply said, "I'm sorry." There was nothing more to say. No redemption. No explanation. Just those words, honest, quiet, and final. I nodded. "Me too." And then he turned and left the room, his footsteps fading up the stairs. I sat there for a long time after that, tea gone cold in my hands, heart heavier than it had been in weeks. The rain had softened outside, reduced to a gentle patter, like even the sky had grown tired. Eventually, I returned to bed. My husband was still sleeping, curled on his side, face half buried in the pillow. I stood there, watching him breathe, wondering how many things he had forgiven silently over the years without telling me. I lay down again, the distance between our bodies still there, but no longer unbearable. I didn't sleep. I just stared into the dark, waiting for the dawn, for the moment when I would have to face what morning would bring. And in that fragile space between night and light, I realized something simple and terrifying. We spent the night together. But it didn't solve anything. It only made everything more real. Morning came with a gray sky and a cold stillness that crept into the bones of the house. I opened my eyes to a room that felt heavier than it had the day before. The air was thick, as if it too carried the weight of my choices. I didn't move right away. I lay still beneath the covers, listening to the soft hum of wind brushing against the windows, and the distant creak of wood shifting in the walls. My body ached, not from exertion, but from something deeper. From emotion worn thin. When I finally sat up, the bed beside me was empty. My husband's absence wasn't surprising. I heard faint movement downstairs, the soft clink of dishes, and realized he was already awake. Already pretending. Or maybe just surviving the only way he knew how. I moved through my routine on autopilot. Washed my face. Brushed my hair. Got dressed in silence. I didn't look in the mirror. I couldn't. I wasn't ready to face whatever expression might be waiting for me, guilt, shame, or worse, indifference. Downstairs, he was at the table with a newspaper and a cup of coffee. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable, but calm. He didn't smile, didn't frown. Just acknowledged me with a quiet nod, and then returned to the article in front of him. I made myself tea and sat across from him, the silence between us stretching like a long, narrow bridge neither of us dared to cross. I tried to sip my tea, but the warmth of the cup in my hands only emphasized the chill beneath my skin. The table felt too wide. The chairs too far apart. I thought of all the breakfasts we'd shared over the years, some warm and chaotic, some tired but affectionate. And now this. Two strangers with rings on their fingers and silence on their tongues. After several minutes, he folded the newspaper and set it aside. He looked at me with an intensity that made me brace myself. "Are you going to tell me everything?" he asked, his voice steady. I didn't pretend not to understand. "No," I said quietly. "I don't think you need everything." He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in reluctant understanding. "I guess that's fair." We sat again in silence, though this time it felt less like avoidance and more like acknowledgement. Something had shifted between us. He knew. I knew he knew. And there was no going back. Later, I went outside to the garden, wrapping myself in a coat against the damp chill. The sky was a uniform gray, and the breeze carried the smell of wet earth and old leaves. I crouched beside the lavender and touched the petals, now beginning to wither. They didn't fight the cold. They just surrendered. I envied that. I spent the next few hours in quiet busyness. Folding laundry. Sweeping the front porch. Watering plants that didn't need it. I moved like a shadow, slipping through the rooms of the house unnoticed. His mother had gone into town again. My husband stayed upstairs, likely pretending to work, though I doubted either of us had the focus for anything practical. Around midday, I walked to the edge of the woods and followed the familiar path that wound behind the house. The trees stood tall and bare, their branches reaching toward the sky like brittle fingers. The wind whistled through them, hollow and mournful. I walked slowly, letting my thoughts unravel with each step. By the time I returned to the house, the sky had begun to darken again. Rain threatened, though it hadn't yet fallen. I stepped into the kitchen and found him there, leaning against the counter, staring at the floor like he'd been waiting for something to make sense. He looked up when I entered. "I was thinking," he said. "Maybe we should take some time apart." The words landed softly, but they hit hard. I didn't speak. I just stood there, heart pounding, thoughts racing. "Not forever," he added quickly. "Just space. Time to figure out what this is. Who we are. If there's still something here." I nodded. Not because I agreed. Not because I disagreed. But because it was the only response I could manage without falling apart. "Okay," I said. He sighed, and for a moment, he looked older than I remembered. Tired in a way I hadn't noticed before. "I'll go," he said. "Stay with a friend. Let you stay here. This place is more yours than mine anyway." "No," I replied, surprising even myself. "I'll go." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Are you sure?" I nodded again. "I need to leave. I need to clear my head. I can't think here." He didn't argue. He didn't push. He just looked at me like he wanted to say something, but the words got stuck somewhere behind his restraint. That night, I packed a small bag. Just essentials. A few clothes. A notebook. My toothbrush. The house was quiet, and every creak of the floor under my feet sounded like a farewell. I moved through the rooms like I was walking through a memory, touching things lightly, as if I could imprint something before I left. Before bed, I walked outside one last time. The porch light cast a dull glow across the garden. The wind had picked up again, and the first drops of rain tapped against the railing. I stood there, breathing in the scent of the storm, letting the cold settle into my skin. He joined me a few minutes later. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there, side by side, watching the sky begin to cry. And in the quiet, I realized that leaving wasn't the end. It was the only honest beginning I had left. The motel I checked into wasn't much, just a small, two-story building on the edge of a quiet road, the kind of place you wouldn't look at twice unless you had nowhere else to be. The walls were thin, the linen stiff, the air tinged with bleach and distant cigarette smoke. But it was clean. It was anonymous. And it was exactly what I needed. I set my bag down by the door and stood in the center of the room, unsure of what to do next. The television on the dresser stared back at me like a dull companion. I didn't turn it on. I didn't want noise. I just needed stillness. Silence that belonged only to me. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around. One window. One lamp. One chair. A space designed for pause, not permanence. And maybe that's what I had come looking for, not answers, not forgiveness, but a moment outside of everything I'd built and broken. A breath between who I had been and whoever I might become. I stayed like that for a long time, hands in my lap, eyes on the floor. My thoughts wandered without permission, looping back to the house, to my husband's expression when I said I needed to leave. He hadn't argued. Hadn't begged me to stay. But I hadn't expected him to. We had always handled heartbreak with quiet agreement. Even in distance, we remained polite. The hours passed slowly. I didn't go out. I didn't eat. I just sat and thought. I wrote a little in my notebook, half sentences, scattered ideas, questions I couldn't yet answer. I wasn't trying to document anything. I was trying to locate myself. That evening, I walked to the gas station nearby and bought a sandwich I didn't finish and a bottle of water I barely touched. I wandered a little, down empty sidewalks and past closed storefronts. The wind picked up. It carried the scent of rain again, though the sky remained dry. It reminded me of the night before. The porch. The silence. His presence beside me, both familiar and unbearably distant. Back in the room, I stood in front of the mirror and studied myself, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. I looked older than I felt. Or maybe just tired in a way that no sleep could fix. My eyes had lost their light. My mouth, its ease. My reflection was not unfamiliar, but it wasn't quite mine either. I changed into something soft and lay in bed without turning off the lamp. The shadows on the ceiling danced gently with the breeze outside. I tried to find comfort in the stillness, but it only reminded me of everything I had left behind. At some point, my phone buzzed. I stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. A message. From him. My husband. It read, *I hope you're safe. Let me know if you need anything. *. That was all. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care. But because I didn't know what I needed yet. The next morning came without rest. I hadn't slept more than a few hours, and even that sleep had been shallow, disturbed by dreams I couldn't hold on to. I showered, dressed, and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The world was already in motion, cars on the highway, birds overhead, a man sweeping leaves off a sidewalk across the street. I walked again. This time farther. The town was small, but not unfamiliar. We had driven through here once, years ago, on the way to somewhere else. I remembered a cafe on the corner. A park with a small pond. I found both, changed but still there. I sat on a bench near the water and watched ducks glide silently across the surface. Children played nearby, their laughter sharp and bright. I felt like I was watching a world I had no part in. Not excluded, but separate. Like a visitor in a life I might have lived if different choices had been made. I thought about the affair. If it could even be called that. One kiss. One night. 1,000 thoughts before and after. I thought about what it meant and what it didn't. It hadn't been about lust. Not really. It had been about recognition. About being seen, heard, understood in a moment I hadn't realized how lost I was. But it hadn't solved anything. It hadn't healed the fractures. If anything, it had split them wider, made the quiet distance between me and my husband even more profound. Because now there were truths neither of us wanted to say aloud. And a part of me wondered if he was relieved I had gone, even as he sent messages asking if I was all right. By noon, I returned to the motel and found another message waiting. This time, it read, *, take all the time you need. I'm here when you're ready. *. I sat with those words for a long time. They weren't forgiveness. They weren't anger. Just space. I needed to respond. I wrote and deleted 6 replies. None felt right. Everything sounded too formal or too fragile. In the end, I typed one sentence. *, thank you. I'm trying to figure out who I am. *. I didn't add anything else. I pressed send, turned off my phone, and lay back on the bed. The ceiling hadn't changed. But something in me had. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something like a beginning. Not hope. Not yet. But the tiniest flicker of clarity. A place to start. I left the motel on a Tuesday morning. The sky was clear for the first time in days, and the air smelled faintly of something warm and green, like the beginning of spring. I hadn't planned on leaving that day. I woke with no decision made, no clear destination. But as I stood at the window with a half-empty mug of coffee cooling in my hands, something in me shifted. Not dramatically. Not like a revelation. Just a quiet, subtle alignment, like a compass that had finally settled north. I packed slowly. Each item into the bag felt like a deliberate step forward. I folded my clothes with care, zipped up the suitcase without rushing. I checked the room one last time, not because I'd left anything behind, but because I needed to say goodbye to the version of myself who had arrived here confused, scared, and silent. That woman had stared at the ceiling and feared the weight of her own reflection. The one leaving now still carried guilt and doubt, but also a measure of clarity. I didn't go straight home. I stopped first at a coastal town we used to visit early in our marriage. The kind of place with wind-worn boardwalks and fading paint on shop signs. We had gone there once on a whim, no itinerary, no expectations. We'd eaten cheap seafood, walked along the beach, and laughed about nothing in particular. It had been years, but somehow, it still smelled the same of salt and sun and distant bonfires. I walked along the shore, shoes in hand, the cold sand firm beneath my feet. The water moved gently, touching the edges of the land like it, too, wasn't sure how close it wanted to come. I sat for a long time on a driftwood log and watched the horizon. Not thinking. Not planning. Just breathing. That evening, I checked into a small guest house. The room was painted in soft blues, the bedding crisp and fresh. I opened the windows and let the sea air fill the space, the breeze tugging at the curtains like a gentle reminder that I was still here, still capable of choosing what came next. The next morning, I took out my notebook and wrote without stopping. I didn't filter. I didn't edit. I just let the words come. I wrote about the distance I'd allowed to grow between myself and the man who had once felt like home. I wrote about the moment I first felt invisible, not because he stopped seeing me, but because I stopped showing myself. I wrote about the kiss, about the night, about how easy it was to mistake being noticed for being loved. I wrote about the silence. The guilt. The aching confusion of wanting to be better and not knowing how. When I finished, I didn't feel lighter. But I did feel present. Fully in the room. In my own body. In this strange, beautiful mess I had created by living imperfectly. Later that day, I drove back. Not because everything was fixed. Not because I had all the answers. But because I needed to stand in the space I had left and decide if I could return not as the person I had been, but as the one I was becoming. The house looked the same. The garden was quieter, the lavender now nearly bare. The porch light was on, even though it was still early. I pulled into the driveway slowly and sat in the car for a few minutes, hands resting on the wheel. He stepped outside before I could open the door. He didn't rush toward me. Didn't wave or speak. He just stood on the porch, waiting. I got out and walked toward him, my bag over my shoulder, my heart beating harder than I expected. He looked tired. Older, maybe. But there was softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A kind of acceptance. A kind of peace. We stood there for a moment, not speaking. Then he gestured toward the table set in the garden, 2 chairs, 2 cups, a pot of tea between them. Want to sit? He asked. I nodded. We walked side by side to the table and sat down. The garden was quiet. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic and inhaled the familiar scent of chamomile. He didn't ask questions. He didn't press. He just poured the tea and waited. I needed to leave, I said finally. Not to escape. But to see myself more clearly. He nodded. I figured. I'm not here to pretend nothing happened, I added. And I'm not asking you to forget. I won't, he said. But I haven't stopped loving you either. The words settled between us like a stone in water, sending quiet ripples through the silence. I don't know what happens next, I admitted. Me neither, he replied. But maybe we don't need to know yet. We sat in the quiet, sipping our tea, letting the stillness stretch between us, not as distance, but as space to grow into. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The lines on his face. The curve of his jaw. The way he watched the world around him like someone who'd learned how fragile it could be. He smiled, not wide, not bright, but real. And I realized that maybe love wasn't about always being right, or whole, or untouched. Maybe it was about returning. About showing up, again and again, not with perfection, but with intention. I reached across the table, my fingers grazing his. He didn't pull away. And neither did I.